Let's commence with the testing for the baggy hoodie. As mentioned earlier, this asset is not complete, but I want to make sure that the primary design will play nice with nCloth before finalizing the sculpt. Baggy clothes take on a life of their own, so I suspect there will be a fair amount of troubleshooting that needs to be done. At the start of this lesson, the baggy hoodie proxy mesh was comprised of just two pieces or panels. The main baggy hoodie with the hood attached and the pockets. But I've decided to split the elastic band at the end into its own panel for reasons I will explain shortly. One thing I want to mention about this baggy hoodie proxy solution is that it's experimental. Ideally, I should have separated the hood from the body so that the hood would have its own panel, like you will see me do with the cropped hoodie in the next lesson. But for now, the hood is stitched onto the body, and I'm going to test this out to see what results I get. I also went with a fairly low resolution for the fold of the hood at the neck area. As you can see, it doesn't overlap like is showcased in the reference. The hood is just welded together at the center to create one consistent connection. I just want to see what a cheaper proxy will produce. I'm doing all these experiments because I'm contemplating a workflow that gives me a few level of detail options for my proxy meshes. So let's say each article of clothing has 2 LODs as far as proxy meshes are concerned. The first I'm calling LOD lower, which will be a simpler cloth room that relies on less nCloth panels. This simulation room will be suitable for animation that is farther away from the camera. The second will be LOD higher, which will use as many panels as are needed to get a successful result. This will be suitable for animation that is closer to the camera. So LOD lower will pretty much be just one proxy mesh controlling everything. Granular articulation of the hood in the neck area or pockets is not important because, as mentioned, this is for simulations that are far away from the camera. Same would apply for the jeans. I would use one proxy mesh for LOD lower, like I did in the previous lesson. And LOD higher. So for the baggy hoodie, I would have a separate panel for the hood, the body, the pockets, the loose hanging elastic band at the base, and whatever other separations are needed. Maybe it might be best if the arms are separated into their own panel. I'll figure that out by the end of this lesson. And for LOD higher of the jeans, I would have separate panels for the belt loops, the pockets, and the hanging ruptured fabric at the knees. LOD higher for the jeans will also have the buttons and the metal parts of the jeans pinned to the final result with the help of a proximity or UV pin constraint. So I look forward to showing you all the result of this plan when we get to that stage. But it's definitely something I think is going to come to fruition. I'm going to have, at the very least, 2 LOD rooms, one for cheaper simulations that are far away from the camera, and the other for more expensive simulations that are close to the viewing audience. All right, so this is my baggy hoodie cloth room, and I want to make some changes. I mentioned previously that I want to separate this elastic band at the bottom, and it's because I want to be able to control it separately from the main body, particularly its elasticity or its firmness, right? I know nCloth, when things move fast, is probably going to stretch this elastic part of it to obscene lengths, right? Especially if it's moving too fast. And I just want to be able to control it because I do want this to feel like the real thing. So I already set this up so that the pocket would be connected to the body. So if I was to hit play and simulate it, it'll go down. And I set a temporary passive collider over there. So I'm just going to undo everything I've done to prepare this again. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the 2 constraints I created. I'll recreate them. I'm just going to select both of them, delete them, and I'm going to remove nCloth from all these items. So I'll remove nCloth, and then I'll go nCloth, remove nCloth. All right, and then I'm going to go down here and find a good selection for this elastic band. As a matter of fact, I'm going to add one more edge loop here. So I'm going to go edge loop, relative distance from the edge, and just go like that. All right, and it should be good. So I should be able to just select the lowest row and then hit shift and period to grow my selection, and that should be the elastic. I should be able to go modeling, looking for an extract command, extract. Yep, that should be fine. So these are now two separate pieces. So I will delete history because of this work that I've done here. So delete history freeze transformations, do it here too. Delete history freeze transformations. And now I'm going to recreate the constraints. But first, let me turn all this stuff back into nCloth. So I'm going to select this, go to my FX menu, go to nCloth, tear it off, and turn this into an nCloth, the pockets into an nCloth, and then the elastic into an nCloth. I should probably name them body, pockets, elastic. And I'm going to recreate the component to component constraints. So it's a fairly easy thing. If you have noticed, I have adjusted these edge loops previously so that they line up so that I can create a nice clean connection between these two items. So let me isolate them. And one easy way to go about this is to go to edge, click here, hold down shift and double click here to select the entire edge between those two edges. I'll go here too and do the same. So I will shift click, and then I'll hold down shift and double click, and it will select that entire edge. So now these two edges are selected, and I can just go constraint, component to component. All right, and I'll do the same here. I will go to the edge, click here, go to the other side, hold down shift and double click. And that should give me that edge. And I'll do the same thing here, go to edge, hold down shift, click this. And I'm looking for an edge over here. This should be fine. With shift still held down, double click. And so I have these two edges now, and I can go and constraint, component to component. So this pocket is now stitched to the body. And then all I have to do now is do the same for this, which is going to be fairly easy because they are in the same spot. Actually, what I'm going to do, they are sitting right on top of each other. I should be able to deal with this. Let me put this on a temporary layer, and I'll go to edge and double click to select the entire edge, and then hide it, and then go to edge here, double click that. So now both edges are selected, and I should be able to do a component to component. So now all of these are stitched together and I'm ready for simulation. Let me just do a quick test in this scene with this simple passive collider. I do want to point out that if you have watched a previous video, I did say that these tests are almost worthless. You have to really get your real animation in here because things behave differently. When you set up these super simple scenes, they don't always echo what is going to happen when you bring in a more complex scene. But let me play this back. All right, so yeah, at least it's behaving. Obviously, all this is not doing what I wanted to do, but we'll get to the arm shortly. But this, I like how there's a separation, and I like the fact that I can set different properties for the elastic versus the body. All right, so they're all connected, and that's just what I wanted to ensure, that they were stitched together correctly. And quite frankly, I am also supposed to be stitching this part of it. This part of it needs to be stuck to the body. So I'm going to create additional component to component constraints over there. I didn't actually process too well. That's definitely something I should have thought about. All right. Could be quick. Let me just select this edge, click here, shift double click, and should be able to select this edge, click, and shift double click. This is not a perfect connection. I'll resurface the main one to connect a lot better than this. They'll be lined up well so that they can connect. All right, this is just a quick solution for what we have. So let me go constraint, component to component, and then do the same thing here. So I'll go constraint, component to component, and this should work. And just hit play. I don't think the strength is going to pull it together. I think it's the constraint method. Let me try weld. See, and that's for this one. Yeah, it'll pull it. Weld will pull it to. Yeah, but not at the expense of bad simulation results. So let's see what it feels like when it settles. Yeah, that's going to impact the simulation too much. I'm going to actually do the alignment and not be lazy. Let's go ahead and just do the alignment. I'll go back and I will detach all the nCloth and align this better. So let me take this menu off, go remove, remove, and remove, and then I'll delete these constraints. And it looks like this one's not removed. Okay, so I'll delete history, freeze transforms, and make the modification. I'm just going to adjust these edge loops so that they're a little bit more aligned and it just looks like it's connected. So I'll select that. All right, so now that everything is aligned, I'm gonna turn all this stuff back into an nCloth. Let me select everything, delete history, freeze transforms, bring up the nCloth menu, turn it off, and create nCloth, create nCloth, create nCloth. This is the body main, the pockets. This is the elastic. Let me just call this hoodie main. Hoodie main. All right, so let me quickly create these comp to comp constraints. Again, I select this edge, click, hold down shift, double click, select this edge, click with shift held down, double click. I can create constraint, component to component. Let me do it down here too. Not there on the body. Go edge, click, hold down shift, double click, then add this edge to it. Go here, shift held down, click, double click, constraint, component to component. And then now I want these ones that I aligned. So we're going to go to edge, click that, hold down shift. Oh, sorry, that's not a connected edge. So click this, hold down shift, click this, hold down shift. Oh yeah, this is not a connected edge either. So I have to select all these separately. It's not a perfect clean topology for selection. Go to this edge, click here, double click, no constraint, comp to comp. And now that side should look a lot more believable as it simulates. Double click. I think this is a clean edge, so let me select that. Yeah, that one's clean. So I can go component to component, and last one is this one. Isolate it. Double click to select this edge. Hide it. Double click to select this edge. You can bring it back and do a constraint, component to component. So the whole thing is connected now. And if I was to do a quick test run, everything should. Yes, it all looks good, and the pocket looks functional. You put his hands in there, and this is connected, and I will be able to give this its own settings so I can get a tighter. You see what it's already doing? Because these both have the same default settings, it's spreading it out and it's losing its elasticity, and it would have been a paint job. I would have had to paint properties on this elastic to make it behave differently from the main thing. So yeah, for starters, this is good. And let's get to the main simulation test. All right, so it's time to get started with the real simulation. I'm going to delete this temporary collider, and I'm going to go to the nucleus, and I'm starting with the walk cycle. The walk cycle starts from -100. So I'll go into the attribute editor and make sure that under my time attributes, I set nCloth to start at -100. Then I'm going to bring in the animation. So I'm port alembic. I'll make sure fit to time range is selected, and I get the walk in, and it's from 100, it settles, and then it does its thing for 224 frames. And I'm also going to bring in the cast jeans animation for the walk cycle. So I'll go import alembic and walk jeans. Go shading, turn off wireframe and shaded. So there's the jeans and the walk cycle. That should be good. Now that I realized it, I noticed that this is a fairly dense mesh, and I don't want nCloth to use this as a collider. It's a lot to deal with. So I'm going to go get the proxy mesh, export that as an alembic so I can use that as a collider. And this jeans, I'll just hide it for when the simulation is over and I want to render a play blast. So I'll go jeans, alembic, cache. Save and just hide it. And then I'm going to go to where I have my cached nCloth proxy jeans. And I want this. So I'll take this and I'll go cache, alembic cache, export selection to alembic. I want the entire type slider. I'll export and I'll call this walk proxy jeans. And it should go through and cache it. I'll pause the video. All right, so the cache is done. I'm gonna go back to my baggy hoodie cloth room. I need to save this. And I can go cache, alembic, import alembic, fit to time range, and I'll get walk proxy jeans. So this is a better thing for my hoodie to collide with. So now that I have that, I'm going to set him to an nCloth passive collider. I'm going to set the jeans to an nCloth passive collider. And initially, I'm going to do the first constraint I know I need. I do want to point out that if I scrub the timeline, you notice I bring the ears down at the negative frames. And the objective of that is to test what this thing will feel like when the hoodie's down. So when we get here, I'll take a transform constraint, and around this area where the ears come down, I'll yank the hoodie off, and the ears will go back up, and just so it hangs so I can see what it feels like when it's off. All right, so the first constraint I'm going to do, this is really simple. I'll go 4, and I just want a component constraint here holding the wrist together. This is one of the most important things that will help hold these creases in place. So I'm going to go constraint, component to component, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. Vertex, vertex, select both of them, and go constraint and constraint component to component. So this is right wrist pin and left wrist pin. I'm just going to do a play blast with nCloth's default settings, so I have a reference to compare all my changes to, right? There's a lot of changes that are going to happen, but I just want a cached result of what default settings give us. So I can come back and start playing around with component to component strengths, properties for the elastic, and whether or not some properties have to be painted with weight painting. So I'll go nCache, create nCache. I'll put it in a folder called baggy, hoodie, nCache. Open, and I'll call it baggy, hoodie, walk baggy hoodie. I just want one file, and I want it to do the entire time slider. And I'm going to select all the nCloth pieces that I need to be cached. That's how to do it. I'm going to save this and go create cache. All right, so here's the first simulation. The default settings, usually never worth anything, it just falls apart. I'm going to shade these things so I can see what's happening. I'm going to assign a new material. I'll go with a blend and just pick maybe like a red color. Make sure the specular color is down, a nice red color. I'll do the same for this. Actually, I'll shade these two the same. Assign new material, blend, bring it down, pick the same red color, but go maybe a little darker, like that, so I can see what's happening. And this I'll just shade blue. Let's pick clarity down. Okay, so there's your default settings. Just taking a look at it to see the mess and also to let you guys see how everything is behaving. All right, so I need more constraints, and I think when I start cranking up these values, things will behave better. The last thing I'm going to shade is I'm going to simulate a pair of boxers. So I'm going to grab these faces. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just crank up some values that I know I need right out the gate for everything. So I'm going to go back here and start with stretch resistance. I'm going to start off at 100. I'm not going to go too high like I used to go with stretch compression and shear resistance. I do want this thing to preserve its original shape as best as it can, but I have to be very careful with these values. So I'm going to start at a high value, the same value I use for the jeans, and I'll probably reduce it or increase it depending on what the results are. So rigidity, input mesh attract, and deform resistance, I'll set to actually not 0.5, 0.05. These are parameters that you have to use very judiciously. And the mass is also something I often have to increase. I'm going to start with 100 because of a particular value that I never really play with, which you really should play with. I think it's under the scale attributes. You're supposed to set space scale, but I like to leave it at the default. So I end up with these really high values that I set on my nCloth, but that's fine. I'm used to it. So I'm going to start at 100. I'm also going to give some damp because I know I'm going to need it. I'll also start at 50 over there. And I'm going to go to collisions, give myself some thickness, not too much, just a little bit there. And self collide with scale, I'll start with 4. And friction, I'll start with 0.5. This thing is sliding all over the place, so I know I definitely need some amount of friction. And then I'm going to save this as a preset. So I'll say save preset. I think I've already done this already, but I'll call it hoodie quick test, save attribute. And then I'm going to go to these presets and manage this preset list because things are getting a little crowded here. So I'm going to delete these old presets from old projects. That's the preset for the jeans. I'm going to leave that alone. And these are my nCloth default settings. I like to keep that. So I'll go close. And then I'll just apply this new preset I made to these other two. I'll go hoodie quick preset, replace, and I will do the same here. Hoodie quick preset, replace. And for now, yeah, this is going to share values. I just want to see what these default values, specifically rigidity, deform resist, and input mesh attract do. So here's the next simulation. I'm going to grab all of these, go and cache, and just create and replace what I have. Place. All right, I'm going to stop the simulation here because I noticed this break, and I'm not going to get through the whole thing before I fix it. But this, for now, I'll resolve with just cranking up my simulation settings. So I'll go to 15. Actually, I'll just go to my final simulation settings so that I can resolve all the penetration issues that occur because of bad solver settings, and not go changing properties to try to fix that when I know that it's this causing the problem. So that just means that my simulations will take a little bit longer, but that's fine. So I'm going to go back and cache this again. I think this is a mass issue, but when I increase mass, I don't expect this type of behavior. It usually works. It worked for the jeans, but in this case, that mass value being that high, I think is making this thing so heavy. So I'm going to put the mass back. Find it. Yeah, I'm going to put it back to the 1. And I also have to remember to do it here on these ones, because they're also 100. So if they're very heavy, and the other reason why it's being pulled down, they have to be changed also. Even though I suspect it's mass, I think it might also have something to do with friction not being enough. But I think mass is contributing. Let me disprove that first. All right, so it doesn't look like mass was the culprit. It looks like a friction problem and also a constraint that I need to create that holds this upper torso area in place, because I don't like how it's stretching anyway, which is something I am going to try first though. I want to see what impact cranking up stretch resistance, which I knew I was probably going to have to do. I'm going to set it to 800 and do one more simulation, and if it's still pulling off and stretching, then I'm going to pin this region in place with a component to component constraint that isn't strong at all, so that there can be some sliding. So basically this region here, let me get a blue pen. So this region here, I'm going to pin here about up to there, just so it stays up there, and probably set the strength to like maybe like a 0.5, just like the jeans, the belt line of the jeans. I do have to be careful though, because in the back I want it to also be snug around the hoodie, because I do want the hoodie to simulate correctly. I don't want it pinned in place, and the end user should be able to take the hoodie off, so it'll be a pin, something like this. But first, let's see what the stretch resistance does. And I'm also going to get into this habit of setting friction on both the collider and the nCloth. So I'm going to go over here and set the friction to 0.5, and let's just see what happens with the hiked up stretch resistance and the friction set on the collider too. Actually, I should do the same thing here on this collider. Set the friction to 0.5. Yeah, I'm definitely going to need that constraint. Things seem to be a little bit better as far as the friction is concerned, but I definitely need that constraint. And I forgot to also crank these up to 800. I don't want them stretching too much either. I always have to remember. For now, I'm going to go back and I'm going to make a handful of changes so I can make a general assessment. One of the first things I'm going to do is I am going to make sure that this is trying its best to hold its form. So I will give it a little bit more compression resistance. Let me go with big value so I can see visible changes. The most important thing I have to do is that constraint at the neck. So I'm going to go to the front view. I'm going to select these two. Go to vertex. Vertex, hit the 4 key. And I have to be very careful with this selection because I don't want to interrupt the hoodie at all. So let me start. For the real thing, I'm going to show the reference shortly. So about that, probably wanted to stick in place there, perspective. And let me hit the 5 key. For the rest of them, I'm going to paint on where I want. So right there, I'll paint just on this surface. Make sure I leave the hoodie alone. And I also want to, let me hide this temporarily. And go here and hide this so that I can paint. Go to vertex mode. Yeah, I should still have my vertex selection. So I can add this to the vertex selection. And I can bring my hoodie back, go to vertex, and yeah, it preserves the selection. So these are what I want held in place, just so that the hoodie can do its simulation around it. So I'm going to go constraint, component to component, and then I'm going to go set it to a number that allows it to slide a little bit. So that's the 0.5. So it'll move just a little bit, and actually maybe shouldn't start there. Let me start at 1, make sure it's being pinned in place. And yeah, let me test out this result. There's also an interesting approach of making some parts of the mesh follow the skinned, underlying skinned rag. I think it's somewhere in here. I'll try it some other time. It's attract and matching mesh, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. I'll talk about it at a later date. I'm going to use it for one of her clothing items. I think I might need it for one of her clothing items, but let's focus on this for now. So I'm going to run this simulation. All right, so it looks like I'm mistaken about how strong this new constraint has to be. So I'm going to go back. Let me see it. Yeah, it is. It needs to hold in place a lot more. So I'm going to put it back at a fairly high number. This one is not going to cut it. I'll go with a 10. That's a lot of sliding movement. And another thing I'm going to do, which I think I mentioned in the last lesson, was when you increase self-collide width scale to a very high number, if I was to show self-collision thickness, if you crank it up, it minimizes deformation in addition to minimizing inner penetration. But it's doing it because now this thing, at least with itself, when it's colliding with itself, it feels like a lot thicker material. So I'm going to set it to maybe just a 6. Turn it off, and I should probably be careful with how much I put on here. I don't really care. Let me see what it is now. Yeah, that's enough. I'll not mess around with those. And turn this off. And I think here, if I was to look at self-collide with thickness, yeah, 4 should be fine there too. I'll just change it on these two. So let's cache. All right, so this is what I have so far. I did have to stop the simulation in the middle because there is an excessive amount of stretching happening in spite of the fact that I have really high stretch resistance values. And another thing that's happening is it not preserving its original form. This one is going to be a little harder to deal with. So after the previously shown result, I started to contemplate using lower resolution geometry for my proxy. I took a detour to perform some other testing. I drafted some very low res geometry, subdivided it for a medium resolution alternative, and did test simulations for both of them. Everything was looking okay until I wrapped my final geometry around them. Both low res and medium resolution versions had a difficult time creating creases that complemented my sculpt creases from ZBrush. Since these lower resolution geometries do not approximate the final mesh too well, they do their own thing as far as crease generation is concerned. And these creases stack onto the crease detail from ZBrush to create a horrible composite. So I discarded them and went back to my original proxy. Even though this detour ended horribly, I walked away from those simulation tests understanding that I need a component-to-component constraint controlling how much the elastic moves down the thigh, just like I did with the jeans belt line last week. This hoodie has an important mushroom shape at the base that is an essential part of its primary silhouette, and I want to preserve that mushroom shape during simulation. After making this change on my original proxy mesh, I was able to resolve the drooping or stretching problem with this component-to-component constraint at the elastic part of the hoodie. So now I have a result that is behaving as expected. It's preserving the creases from ZBrush and adding in reasonable creasing under the arm to complete the sculpted creases. Now that I have a result that is behaving correctly, I spotted an error in the primary shapes of this hoodie that definitely need to be addressed in ZBrush when I go back to finish this sculpt. Initially, I thought it was the amount of slack under the arm area and in the armpit. So I made some edits to fix this excess material under the armpits. But after running new simulations, I run into a new problem. With more fabric now tucked into the armpit, collisions become more difficult to calculate when the arm comes down. When there was no material there, nCloth didn't have to worry about calculating cloth in such a tight space. But now that it has to do it continuously, inner penetration eventually takes hold and the arm blasts through the fabric. So I need that slack. What I don't need is the slack on the actual arm. There's so much fabric on the arm that when the hands are down by the sides, all the fabric is pushed outward and the fit looks a little weird. Now it's supposed to look like that because if you look at the reference, when the wearer of this hoodie has their hands down, you do have that triangle shape, but not too much. I was getting way too much, and it's because there's just so much slack on the arm. And by the way, collision thickness and self-collide width scale also contribute to this a little. When those two values are set to low numbers, the fabric acts very thin, and the arm is able to push against it and compress it a lot on one side, leaving the other side with so much negative space. But there is a downside to keeping self-collide width scale in particular too high. You will see huge gaps when the fabric tries to collide with itself. So one has to find a happy medium between high and low collision thickness and self-collide width scale. I reduced it to 4, but as you can see, it's still high. There's still a huge gap. And I ended up bringing it down to about 3, and that seems to be the sweet spot where things behave. And by the way, this was only done for the body of the hoodie. The pockets and the elastic, I left them alone at the value of 6 that I started with. Here's a comparison of the end results. On screen left, I have the original shape with all the slack in the arms. On screen right, I have a simulation with the slack in the arms reduced. There's enough of a change, but I definitely need some more reduction in the arm slack. Even though a lot of the reference of this hoodie shows it with a lot of slack in that area, I think go with a more fitted look. I don't know for sure, but I'll make a decision before I start texturing this hoodie. If I change my mind and I want the opposing option, I can use Transpose Master and ZBrush to easily shape my finished result. Now, before continuing, I eased up on how much the arms come close to the body in the walk cycle. If you're wearing something this heavy, you wouldn't bring your arms all the way down to the sides, so your forearms are brushing up against your hips. You would accommodate the massive amounts of fabric by keeping your arms rotated outward laterally a little bit more. So I updated the alembic with the new changes and it propagated into the file. And now that things are looking better, I moved on to introduce a higher mass value back into the simulation. If you remember, I reduced it earlier in the video when I thought it was primarily responsible for the drooping and stretching I was getting. But I need it now because things feel puffy at the shoulders and I need the shoulder part of the hoodie to drape more. I went with different masses for the various pieces. The body and the elastic have a mass of 50 and the pockets have a mass of 20 because I don't want them to feel too heavy. So this test has given me the values and constraint solutions that I need to make my final result work. And it has also given me feedback on what I need to change in ZBrush. Here are some more conclusions that I have reached about nCloth simulations in this and a previous lesson where I did the jeans. My isolated clothing approach for each article of clothing allows each clothing item to be simulated independently of each other. So all properties on the nCloth and the nucleus can be set on a per clothing article basis. A good example would be using different gravity values in the nucleus for various clothing types if there's a need to alter gravity. The more panels you break the clothing into, the more you can isolate settings to the split up parts. I'm considering making the arms their own panel so I can set unique collision properties for the arms and the body of the hoodie. This is also possible with painting vertex properties, but the separate panels provide more flexibility as not every property is available for painting. Extremely low proxy geometry works in key areas where sculpted creases need to be preserved. But if the low proxy geometry does not approximate the final mesh well, a horrible composite will be generated when simulated creases try to stack on top of sculpted creases. Any blatant penetrations are a result of the cheap quality of some of the proxy meshes I developed. Another culprit is the fact that the proxy meshes are not sitting inside the thickness of the final mesh, like I described in the last lesson. Another culprit of penetration is bad underlying deformation of the collider meshes. And a final culprit, and most likely the most important, is lower solver settings. Penetrations are almost always resolved when solver settings are keyed to a higher value in problem areas. Before I wrap this up, I'm going to quickly go over which parameters were key to make the backflip and the rebound animation work. For this backflip, I keyed solver settings to a higher number for better quality simulation in the middle of the flip, just like I did with the jeans. Friction is also disabled temporarily in the middle of the flip to stop the fabric from sticking to itself awkwardly in some parts. I also keyed the strength of the elastic constraint to disable by setting it to a value of 0 during the fast parts, but it returns back to a strength of 3 afterwards. This allows the whole hoodie to react to gravity properly during the flip because it's not pinned in place at the hips. Also, this starched up feel on the hood is one of those things that could have been resolved independently of the rest of the parts of the hoodie if the hood was its own cloth panel. It's obviously coming from input mesh attract, deform resistance, and rigidity, or the culprit might just be one of them. But as stated before, I also want to remind that this can be fixed by painting vertex weights, but I'm leaning more towards the workflow of having several separate nCloth panels or pieces. It's just a bit more faster in my opinion. Painting vertices feels more like a permanent change. Also, there's a penetration problem on the arm for the backflip that I did not address, but I'm sure hiking up solver settings at that part of the animation would resolve it. And lastly, for this rebound jump, I keyed the constraint at the elastic to slowly have no influence. So from 3 to 0. All right, that's the end of this lesson. In the next lesson, I will run a test for the last article of clothing he has, the cropped hoodie. The cropped hoodie has a lot of parts that need to play nice. See you in the next lesson.